Morning, morning.
We couldn't get your sound.
Yeah, I can't fully hear you though. Have you got a mic on? Okay, great.
We have you now. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day two of our seventh annual Forevermark Forum, again in this beautiful city of Delhi. Now that we had a very energizing day yesterday, I hope all of us rested well after the party. But I think just touching upon the key themes that we talked yesterday and why we believe that the future is now, if not somewhere really 5 years, 10 years from hence. And the whole perspective that we talked about yesterday was that we have the innate capability to carve out a future that lies ahead of us and really do things and take the actions and make decisions today so that future makes more purposeful sense for all of us. Now, moving from our experience over the last 7 years, we believe that knowledge exists not just for us as diamantes or retailers or jewelry business, but there's a sea of knowledge that exists from people who are claimed in different paths they've taken on, but somewhere the paths merge and there's always commonality of what we as an industry can learn. Over the years, we've had some very inspirational sessions and people who inspired us, like Mr. Sanjay Reddy. We had variety of people with different walks of life who inspired us from different ways. Today, I'm very happy to have Mr. Ronnie Screwvala with us today. Our apologies, Ronnie took a flight from Siberia day before yesterday, and he came down with an ear infection. He was requested by the doctor not to take a flight. But thank you, Ronnie, for accepting still and being with us again. But some things about Ronnie, he's someone who's really inspired me across my journey as a professional and even as a student. He's been a serial entrepreneur. He's from a business that he started by setting up cable television, the first cable television network in the country, to being the biggest toothbrush manufacturer in the country, to become a media icon on producing films and making the whole production business to a different level. He got Disney in the country, collaborated with them, and the year 2012, he divested back to Disney at about 2,000 crores of his organization. But he and Zarina have started Swadesh, and they're making a big impact in the social welfare of millions of people in upcountry Maharashtra. And that's a great step that he's taken on his personal life. Our theme, which is the future is now, and one of the most inspiring reads I've had, Ronnie, that you've written, is about, where he says, dream with your eyes open. That's the book that he's written, which really inspired me, and I think merges again to our theme. And I'm grateful to Ronnie that he's taken this again, even while he's down, but he's taken the time to be with us. So over to you, Ronnie. We all are really looking forward to your perspective. Thank you. Enjoy the
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And firstly, my profuse apologies for not being there in person. I really wanted this to be a highly interactive session, and hopefully it still will be. I guess the only shortcoming for me will be that normally when I'm having a conversation, by the end of the first 5 minutes, one can look at the audience and figure out how many are looking down at their phones and still carrying on with their messages or emails, and then you know what the attention span you need to do. And in my early days in theater, that's what I learned. When you're on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday as a hobby, trying to deliver to 1,000 people audience, I think what you look out for at that stage is coughs. And since that early stage, where I believe that communication is a very important tool with whatever you do. So I think whenever there's an interactive session or a talk, in my theater days, I used to look out for coughs, because if you hear a lot of coughs, means the audience is restless. I think that now is an anachronism, because the mobile technology has sort of replaced that. That anyway, if your head is down, most people think the excuse is that you're making notes from that talk, but actually you're just carrying on and doing your own personal talk. So maybe I won't get that sense in the pulse, but I'll try and be as sharp and contrite as I can be, and really start off. So as I said, this was supposed to be an interactive session, and what I think I'll sort of share a little bit is my journey and multiple of lessons that one has learned along the way, and share those with you, and then sort of open it up for questions at the end. And I think I've been sort of blessed and fortunate enough to have a first innings and a second innings, and I'll sort of deal with that too. I think India today, if you look at that as a cusp, we are basically an entrepreneurial nation, but at the same time, overall, at least when I started, very, very, very few first generation entrepreneurs. And I think even in your trade and whatever else, I think a fair amount of them, of you all there are professionals, a fair amount of them, more I think would be family run businesses. And I'm sure a few or many may still be first generation entrepreneurs. And I think my learning and experience as a first generation entrepreneur, coming from a family that otherwise was, we were in the lower middle class, and we had my father, my brother were highly educated and were professionals in their field. And here I wanted to stop my studying career at BCom and start becoming an entrepreneur. And all I can say is, for a first generation entrepreneur, the best way I can sort of describe that is it's extremely liberating, because it's a white canvas. There is no hierarchy that you're following there, and there's nothing that you're inheriting in that context. But it can be extremely, extremely lonely. So how do you sort of balance feeling liberated with feeling lonely? And I think that's pretty much a first generation's entrepreneurial story right through. Very early days when I started cable TV, and this was many, many years ago. And today it sounds like not such a great idea. But at that time, when we only had a single television set, and in fact, you didn't even have a television remote, to actually sell the concept of a second channel on your television set, to most people was a no-brainer. So when we started up and we said we're going to talk about cable television in the country, everyone thought, wow, what a great idea. And then almost for the next 365 days, in a full entire year, we didn't get a single customer, a single billing, or anyone subscribing to us. And I think there were 2 or 3 lessons that I learned from those early days that stood me in test. The first one, I think, was in the first 60 days, I realized that I needed to go door to door to understand everything that was going forward. And I think that element of being able to go door to door, and first of all, nobody cares for a cable TV operator coming in there. So we got more doors banged on our face than ever before. So to take that sort of feedback and keep going gives you a strong sense of resilience. But that door-to-door approach gave me a very clear, strong insight into the consumer, which I would have never got if I hadn't been on that field force right through. And that was a very good and very strong learning at that stage, that understanding consumer at that absolute detail level, where we suddenly realized that before we were a cable operator, we actually needed to be an interior designer. And the reason I say that is the biggest resistance everyone had was, but you'll be bringing a cable into my apartment, and how will that run? And I've got concealed wiring. So essentially, here we were turning project managers before actually selling what we thought was an extremely creative concept. So I think the context of understanding and having the importance of understanding who your consumer is was very important. And I think the second one I learned at a very early stage, a very hard lesson, was, and it stays with me right now, is how important it is when you're starting something, you're running something, about staying the course. Most people have this sort of timelines in which they operate and say, I'm going to give this 1 year, I'm going to give this 2 years. And I do believe that in the first 6 months, there were many naysayers who told us, well, I think this is well before its time and you should give it up. And we stayed the course. And I think the only reason we were successful in that business and successful to start cable television in India was because we stayed the course. So those are my 2 sort of critical takeaways from those early days in cable TV. Later on, quite in a diversified manner and quite opportunistically, I had an opportunity to start a toothbrush manufacturing business. And completely unrelated from the DNA. But when you're young and you're a first generation entrepreneur, and it's your first time you're doing that, the first reflex for you, and for many of us looking at this, is being opportunistic. And strategy comes later, opportunity comes first. And I think that was a couple of things that I learned there. I think the 2 key ones when I started off my toothbrush business was really, when opportunity knocks, what are you going to do about that? And how critical at that early stage of development of any organization or company or business is being opportunistic. And I think the second one was, and that I think faces almost all of us, is the core competence and our domain knowledge. And I know a lot of people question and query that I'm shifting sector, or I'm shifting industry, or I'm starting something on my own, and this is not my core. And I think that was a question I asked myself. What did I know about toothbrush manufacturing in every sense of the word? And I think in many aspects, the learnings that I had, that if you have some umbrella factors to me of overall approaching a business, my first thing was therefore to go out and find co-founders. One who was better than me when it came to sales and marketing, one who was better than me when it came to technology and everything else that's set up the business. What I thought I brought to the business was credibility, was scale, was brand, things that again stood for me a long term. And so from then and up till now, and now in my second innings when I'm looking at other things, that question keeps coming up. What is the importance of core competence and domain knowledge, specifically whether you're an entrepreneur or you're a leader in an organization? And how do you sort of bridge that gap between core competence and domain knowledge in today's day and age, where in any case, all of us need to straddle multiple aspects? So I think those are my two learning lessons from that. And then the third was when it came to media. The exciting part for me there was it was a clean slate. When we started off in media and entertainment, it wasn't even called media and entertainment. It was something where you had to decipher and design it and actually describe it. A lot of people today keep always questioning, how do I attract talent? How do I retain talent? And I think for me at that early stage, I learned some very critical lessons. Almost the first 30 people that I hired in the company, after I interviewed them, 100% of them said, look, we're really excited, but they were young. But I'm afraid my parents don't have a buy-in on this media and entertainment industry. So I'm afraid you'll have to come home and speak to them because they're not quite clear why I'm joining this company. And so after interviewing the candidates that I shortlisted, I was being interviewed. And as I said, as a first generation entrepreneur, as a leader, you don't have any barriers when it comes to that. But it was a great learning experience because, and I think today when a lot of people keep asking, how do I attract talent? Or how do I retain talent? I think when I communicated with those 30 parents about letting their kids coming into a sector and industry which most people from the outside thought was extremely flaky, not well funded, wouldn't bring stability, and how would they even grow from that prospect, is about evangelizing, is about communication, is about clarity of vision, and that's what you need to communicate. And I think, to me, after that, I haven't really looked back and haven't had a challenge and a question when people say, how do you attract talent in a business and how do you retain talent? So I think those were some of the early ones. And today, as I look to all of you all, I think the jewelry business and the media business in many aspects, there was a lot of commonalities. Primarily, in many ways, most of us are creating something out of nothing. And that's a big strength, whether it's in design, whether it's in creativity. And I think my strengths that I sort of took away and what I thought was important in media, which I think have correlations to the sector that you're in, and what I was obsessed with. One was scale, because you can't really be in an absolute startup sector and industry unless you actually think about scale and how can you take that to a certain scale. The second one was brand. And I know a lot of people mix up the word brand when we talk about it. It's such a large word that we all think brand means actually marketing or creating awareness, whereas actually building a brand is in a very, very long-term, very engaging thought process. And I'm sure in your sector, it's equally and critically important, and how important brand and credibility would be, because that's what people are actually buying into. They don't really know the specifics of what they're buying, and therefore creating that credibility and brand is very critical. The third for me, which was great training and learning, was trends. And I think that's another critical element in business. How do you preempt trends? How do you look around the curve and actually understand what consumers may want before it's time? And I think today it's almost mandatory in any business for us to be able to do that. And again, fourth was understanding the consumer. Outside of these broad lessons that I learned partly from cable television, partly from toothbrushes, and partly from media, I think some of the overlying ones in my first innings, if I would headline, would be the difference between profits and wealth creation. And again, as family-run businesses and many others, I think we look at overall in terms of profitability, and then we look at, okay, so this is my 100% company, and I'm going to be profitable, and what's mine and what's not. But I think when you get into the sphere of wealth creation, obviously profitability plays a part, but they're completely different criteria. And I think between the first 5 years of starting a media enterprise, and then when I decided that I wanted to attract the likes of Rupert Murdoch or Warburg Pincus and get into private equity, that's when the penny dropped with me, that profitability in a business is important, and wealth creation does not necessarily always be a multiple of profitability. It has a lot more that you have to do in an organization to be able to understand where you're creating wealth for the shareholders and everything else. Which then brought me to the second learning, which is the importance or the differentiator between what one would call ownership and control. And I started as 100% owner of the business. Then I realized as I went forward that I needed two co-founders. So I gave them 15% each. And then I was 70% with 15%, 15%. And then slowly, that was the time when we got in our first investor. And it was a quick succession of bringing in Warburg Pincus at that time. This was their first ever investment in India, even before Bharati and Marico. And it was their first investment in media overall in Asia. And almost less than 9 months later, News Corp, Star TV, Murdoch invested in the company. And that's when you kind of realize at that stage that the minute you're not 100% shareholder of your company, you have to be able to differentiate between the CEO, between being a shareholder, between ownership and control. If I can be a little of a skeptic and a critic, I say today a lot of scale in our businesses is lacking, primarily because many of us as founders and promoters or leaders are obsessed with control, are obsessed with this magical figure of 51% control. Now, if you've reached a particular stage and you have deep pockets, which are with a few family-owned players that can still own 51% and be at large, but for most of us, it's a handicap. And therefore, it was a strong learning for me how to differentiate between being the CEO of an organization and being what I thought was an owner. And so therefore the my company to the company, that entire transition is a very important one. And to that extent, I think wealth creation, ownership and control have a very sort of correlated aspect to that. The third I kind of realized is that even though I thought media was a business in which I was really there, I was in many aspects the outsider. And the reason I say outsider is because I may have been familiar with media, and in many ways, when I decided to be an entrepreneur, I was definitely not clear that I was going to be a media entrepreneur. I think serendipity teaches you a lot of things and brings you a lot of ways. But for me at that stage, and especially when we enter the creative business of movie making, which is a highly incestuous business, highly clannish, and I mean that in a positive sense, not in a bad sense, you were the outsider. How do you deal with businesses where you feel or you're made to feel the outsider, and yet being able to grapple with that thought? And that actually teaches you a fair amount of lessons. Overall, a couple of the other sharp ones would be, there is no way in today's day and age where you can feel the element of status quo. It's absolutely critical that I think if anyone is looking at any element of status quo, that's out of the window. So constantly on every single day, how do I break what I would call status quo? And the next one would be looking for inflection points. For the first 10 years of our business, because I was a first generation entrepreneur, because I didn't start with any bank balance, and because funding and private equity was very, very difficult and almost unheard of. Today, it's a badge of honor for everybody and much more easier for entrepreneurs to get funding. At that time, it was no banks and no private equity, no VC. That wasn't a clear-cut definition. So how do you look for inflection points? And therefore, the first 5 years or 7 years of our business, we were a B2B business where we would create documentaries, ad commercials, airline in-flight programming, be a dubbing agent for almost 40 global clients that came into India, post-production studio, an animation studio, an outsourcing base, and a very diversified model. And then around the time when we were going to be a listed entity, it was the first time the penny dropped to me that we're not in control of our destiny, being a B2B model. And in 18 months, we had an agenda to move from a completely B2B model where we were a service provider in content, in creativity, to multiple people and multiple clients, to be a B2C player where everything we wanted to do, we wanted to create our own brand and we wanted to be directly in touch with the consumer. And soon in 3 months when we were making that transition, we realized that almost everyone who was our customer was going to be our competitor as we morphed from B2B to B2C. And how do you actually take that business and in 18 months almost shut down all the businesses that you built for the first 5-7 years? Because you had to move to be a broadcaster. So everyone you were creating content for was actually going to be a competitor for you. How you were going to be a movie studio and be an outsider. How you were going to be a game studio and look at an entire universe of 100 million people and yet be competitive to the other ones. So I think looking for inflection points and understanding the definition of whether you're building a B2B business or a B2C business. And to me, scale, I don't think we'd have been able to build a brand or build a scalable business if we hadn't taken the decision to move to a direct-to-consumer part of the business. And second last, I would say in my learnings was the element of culture. And I think that's something we all grapple with. And I think we all kind of take it for granted. And I think in many ways, we all assume the culture is from the founder. And a couple of hooks that came to us at the very early stage. One, my element of being able to bring in co-founders and therefore create a core team where at least the first 20 or 30 people felt a very high level of ownership into the organization. And I think part of it happened by my strategy, and a lot of that happened by accident. And that was because in the first 3 years, we had so many crises, and I would say that almost 5 times we were almost shutting down and didn't have money to pay the payroll. Those are the times that if you can look at all your employees straight in the eye, tell them what the problem is. Bad news comes first, good news comes second. And I think the binding that happens when at those crisis moments were to me a very great learning experience, because it kind of bound the organization a very different way. The people who stay with you at that stage then stay with you for the next 10 years. And so how do you build a culture where at least 30 people in an organization that is going to grow to 2,000 people at that core feel such a high sense of belonging, and each of them adopt another 20 people as you go forward? And that was, to me, a very critical element of really being able to build scale. The other part I think that worked well for me was at a very early stage, both my wife and she was a co-founder at that stage, and actually I wasn't even married to her at that stage when we founded the company, and I brought her in as a co-founder, was the element that we felt 10% of whatever we did, we would put out for a good cause. Now, I remember 7 years later when the first shareholder of Warburg Pincus came in, they said, that's fine, but what about the years in which you're not going to make a profit? And I said, well, we're entrepreneurs, we'll figure that out. But what I realized that even when we took our first 10,000 square foot office, 1,000 square foot we devoted to a creche and an old age home. And it was a day affair. But the entire staff rallied around like this was theirs. So to me, this sense of ownership and this sense of actually bringing in a sense of a social cause were two very strong binding elements that set what I think was the culture for the organization for the next 12 to 15 years. So that by the time we grew to 2,000 people, and even when I finally divested in a media business where most people think the founder promoter is almost indispensable, and how 90% of them transitioned into a much larger multinational, which is the Walt Disney Company, in a very seamless way. And I think those were early days that cemented the ability for me to do that. And lastly, I think I would say on my learning lessons there was exits. And Sachin just said at the opening, Ronnie's a serial entrepreneur. Now, I personally don't buy into the word serial because that actually means it's premeditated, like a serial killer is. And that doesn't work that way because you can't really premeditate and you can't really plan exits. As much as today the younger generation feels, oh, I'm going to be in this for 4 years, I'm going to build the company, and then I'm going to sell it. And I keep looking at them and saying, which part are you going to be able to pre-anticipate? Are you building the business by your own vision, or are you building the business so that in 4 years, a hitherto unknown buyer or entity or investor is the vision on which you're going to build the business? And I think that's flawed in the first place. And second, you can't really time exits. So while one may have the brand for being a serial entrepreneur, almost all the exits, and I'll just give you anecdotally a few of them, for you to realize that you can't really plan them. When we started our cable TV business, and about 4 or 5 years later, actually the entire IPR, the Copyright Act became so complicated that to me, for us to work and run this as a completely above board legal business didn't make any sense. And almost all the cable operators were crossing municipal roads. So today, if you see India, and you'll see all the overhead cables in any big, small or medium city, it's because our Post and Telegraph Act does not allow cable television to dig a hole. And they've never got permission from the Post and Telegraph Authority that allows you to cross roads. So essentially, they string cables across. So as soon as that happened, I felt this was a business that was not long-term for me because I didn't know how to handle the uncertainty of the elements of what was there. And at that stage, I had a COO who came and just said, I think I'm going to leave. I'm joining a Madras industrial group who wants me to start a cable television company there. So I just looked at him at that moment and I just said, well, why don't you tell them that you can go and you can buy this business and take it and start it from scale. And that to me was the trigger point for an exit. It was just at that moment opportunistic. It wasn't premeditated or planned that I said I'll build a cable television business. Later on, the toothbrush business for me was a good cash cow, a stable business, never as sexy as media was. And therefore, with my co-founders, I spent maybe 4 hours a week on it. But at the time at which Rupert Murdoch had bought 49% into UTV at that stage, and about 6-7 years later, we found that relationship was not as strategic as we thought it would be. And I wanted to take the company public, but I would have been too diluted, so I wanted to buy back their shares. And so I felt the only way I could buy back that 49% shares of Murdoch, which by that time had diluted, was by selling my toothbrush operations, raising some cash, and being able to consolidate my shareholding in a primary company. Again, not premeditated and very difficult to sell a B2B business, but it took a certain period of time. Much later, we started a broadcast channel when we were looking at transforming to be a B2C model. I remember Dalit Pathak, who was at that time the head of Warburg Pincus, came up and said, look, you want to start these channels? And Vijay Mallya has this channel in the south of India, Tamil channel called Vijay TV, and he doesn't know what to do with it and he wants to sell it. And the next day we were at his home for a 10 o'clock meeting. He arrives at 1 a.m. So for 3 hours we were just chit-chatting till he arrived. And by an hour later, we had kind of struck a deal to buy Vijay TV. Now at that stage, again, I was clear that I wanted to get into broadcasting, but I didn't know the Tamil language. But the deal was structured in a manner which was extremely interesting for us to be able to take the plunge. 3 years later, I went to News Corp and our Star TV partners, and I said, look, we built actually this, and we took this channel, and we've actually built it into something really big. You don't have a regional footprint at all. You're only a Hindi broadcaster. Why don't we do a 50-50 joint venture in the south of India? They were excited about it, and they said, but we want to run it. And I said, no, that's one precondition. I want to run it because I think we've brought this to a certain level, and we want to have a time for all South Indian languages. So then 3 business development heads from there came up with a very, into inverted commas, smart idea and said, look, here's our business plan. If we run it, here's what we think we can achieve. I looked at that Excel sheet and I knew that even if I tried for the next 10 years, I wouldn't be able to reach even 30% of the target they were meeting. So immediately, right on that meeting, I said, done, you all can run it, but then you have to work on these targets and the joint venture needs that as a minimum guarantee. A year went by, and obviously they met only 30% of the target because that was in any case a substantial growth. By the second year, they came back and said, look, this is not going to work. We're cutting out too big a check. We'll have to buy you out. Finally, we sold it at a huge premium because of the simple reason that we were doing a discounted cash flow on their business plan set up 2 years before to take that forward. Was this planned? Did I want to get into broadcasting to actually exit? Not at all. But again, it was an offer you couldn't refuse. And they were a principal shareholder in the parent company. And here I was having an argument with them at the subsidiary level about sticking to their contracts and business plans, which I knew they were bleeding because 3 smart people or not so smart people had made those projections. And finally, when I sort of sold UTV, again, at that stage, and this was only 6 years back, I remember for at least 9 months, the kind of flack that I got, that it almost sounds like you're abandoning it. How can you be in media for such a long period of time and actually sell the company that you necessarily founded? And I think at that stage, the crossroad that I was at was extremely clear. I was at about a 23-24% shareholder in the company, and I knew that the next level of growth would require a lot of capital for us to build UTV. And that means I would have been diluted. And if I stepped below maybe 20%, I need to question who was I really working for, number one. Number two, Disney was an extremely great partner. They already owned 45 to 50% of the company. I used to sit with them in their strategy groups for what they wanted to do in India, and they would always be on our board to understand what. And the more we heard each other, the more it sounded like it was a complementary business. And when I reflected and looked at the 2,000 people that work for us at UTV compared to the 300 people that were working for Disney in India, I felt, wow, I think there's a great sense of pride for them to work with a UTV brand, but it'll be a 10x sense of pride if they're visiting Carlton at Disney. So it kind of all reflected. At that point in time, did I feel I knew exactly what I wanted to do after that? No. Did I feel I was in cashing out on something? No, but it just felt right. That if I had worked 15 to 18 years of my life to build a brand and build a company at scale, I couldn't think of a better brand than the Walt Disney Company, who respects brands around the world, to be able to part that legacy with. None of these that I gave you as examples actually mean exits can be pre-planned. And I think when people set out to build businesses to create value, to be able to exit them, are completely flawed. Because when we sold Hungama to a kids channel to Disney, most people said you had this in your mind. You're a serial entrepreneur. Look what you did with Vijay TV. Look what you did with toothbrushes. Look what you did with cable TV. And my sense was, which part of what? Because we had brought in programs from Japan called Doraemon and Shin-Chan, which even today mothers keep pointing fingers at me and say, "You're the guy who's brought Shin-Chan to this country. My kids are addicted to that." And at that particular stage and point in time, I said, look, if I thought that in 18 months I wanted to sell a channel to Disney, I wouldn't have called it Hungama, because almost for 30 days after we sold it, everyone at Burbank in California couldn't even pronounce the name Hungama. And I wouldn't have brought in programs like Shin-Chan and Doraemon because it's so un-Disney-like in its brand. So I think the element I'm trying to put here, and to a lot of first-generation entrepreneurs also, is you can't plan exits, and it's a flawed approach if you're looking at it from that perspective. So I'd sort of end this part and just talk a little bit about my second innings and then sort of pause for question and answers by saying today, as we all sort of look at the challenges of jobs, I do personally believe that entrepreneurship is a huge solution for job creation opportunities in India. But at the same time, I do feel that it's flawed in its present construct. And I'm using it with 3 Fs, which I normally describe it with. One is fear of failure. 25 years back, when I became a first-generation entrepreneur, there was huge stigma and a fear of failure. We don't evangelize, we don't talk freely about, we definitely don't evangelize failure. And it's an absolute, it's going to happen to you once, twice, 100 times. But there's a huge stigma in India on failure. Anywhere else, it's on the asset side of your balance sheet. And in India, it always comes out in the liabilities. And I think that's a mindset change that we need to do. The second one, I think, is family. Today, again, this is partly because of our socioeconomic reasons, where most people feel a job security is important. But we do know that today there isn't that kind of security, there isn't jobs. But I think that mindset changed with family. And I think the third one is in funding. Not today the lack of opportunity for funding, but the problem is that the large funds go to a very small pinnacle at the top of the pyramid. And then there's a fair amount for the larger demographic at the bottom end of the pyramid. But I think today the way entrepreneurs think through in India is a cause for worry, is my personal view. And I do spend a lot of time trying to communicate that, because I think the element of, raise funds, burn it, raise funds, burn it, you're not building a business. You're almost half beholden on your next fundraising round. So I think between fear of failure, family support, and if you don't get your funding right and create a business model, the badge of honor today, and most of our media actually evangelizes a unicorn. So actually that becomes how much money raised is more important than what kind of a business you built. And I think that's flawed over a certain level. And I think that's, to a certain extent, needs a certain level of reflection. But overall, if we really need to move forward, entrepreneurship is going to solve what we need to do in this country. And so I'll kind of end by saying, I've been blessed that I think in my first innings, I could do something that I really, truly enjoyed. And that's when you feel really blessed. That it's a business that you built. Of course, you had multiple failures, incredible setbacks, a lot of stress. But it was something that you also enjoyed doing. And I was in a sector that the joy of doing it and the fun of doing it was as much as the thrill of building a business. And I think I was equally blessed that after all that, I could do something where I could actually pause, move out of that, and reflect myself and start a second innings. And I think for people who are looking at that crossroad, and that crossroad can happen at 40, at 50, at 60, it's not an age criterion. I think it's a great reflection point. It is an extremely important reflection point. And for me, it's been important because many times in your first journey, there's a lot that I would say you have to do. You start a business, you're on a treadmill, and there's a lot you have to do. You list your company, and then pretty much 50% of what you're doing is based on quarterly analysis, analysts, the pressure that goes with there. So the ability that you can now move and reflect, and to me the differentiating was to myself is, I said, Ronnie, I think I have to move from almost 50% of the things in my previous avatar I had to do and 50% I wanted to do. How do I move that now to 100% of doing things that I want to do? And that again is an opportunity that you get very, very rarely. And that's the sense. It could be not because you are an exit. It could be because you decided to leave your job, take a break, start a sabbatical, start something else, move out of your family business, start on your own. Whatever that crossroad and opportunity is, it's a very, very important point of reflection for you to be able to say, what do I want to do versus what I want to have to do? And for me, that was an important part, want to do and creating impact. And so I thought by reflection that I would take it a little bit more easy, having exited a business. But I think when those points come to you and you feel what is it that's going to create impact, and I think over the period of the last 5 years, ever since I exited the business to Walt Disney, which is about 6 years back, I've been a critic of my own self because if I had one big regret in my first 15 to 20 years, and if somebody in my early days had mentored me on the importance of focus versus diversification, I think we'd have been a much larger organization. And therefore, that kind of stayed with me in part of my reflection, how important today focus versus, and a lot of us as entrepreneurs or as leaders, we hit our glass ceiling very easily. We look at a business and then we hit a glass ceiling, but glass ceilings are there to be shattered. But what happens is we reach the glass ceiling and we feel, okay, the consumer is not ready or the market is not big, and then we start diversifying horizontally. And actually, we've created two problems. We've not broken the glass ceiling, which we haven't. We've lost focus and started to diversify. The other part to me was that we had our not-for-profit that we had started, as I mentioned earlier, at a very small scale. And now that we had the liquidity event, both of us reflected that what do we want to do? And I think today for a lot of people who are looking at the word philanthropy, which I think really is a 20th century word and it needs to be changed in the 21st century. Because for most people, it is cutting a check. And I think that today more than ever, if I see the younger youth today and their reflection, it's no longer a context where you first need to have in order to give. And I think that's an important definition that the younger generation is teaching us right here, right now. Today, the US brags that 2% of their GDP goes towards philanthropy, and in India it's only 0.2%. But I can say that the balance 1.8% of ours is actually sweat equity. Because the number of people that actually do this without necessarily cutting a check, and that we don't hear of, and there are unsung heroes. And I think the first year after exiting, the kind of research both my wife Zarina and I did to understand this sector and this space, both at models in India and overseas, gave us a lot of reflection. But it also gave me the very clear idea that if I was going to spend 40% of my time for a not-for-profit organization, compared to, and my wife spends 100% of her time for a not-for-profit, that means I could never be a CEO or a leader again, because I would never do a right service to a new business that I would start if I was 40% already committed to a not-for-profit. And I wanted to. That was my desire. That was my want. And so, therefore, the reflection came in that whatever I do the next time around has to strongly be with co-founders who would lead that. And I would go with my strengths. My strengths I would analyze as brand building, ability to be scale, and strategy. And I think over the last 5 years, it's been an extremely interesting journey in a DNA completely different. To look at the social sector, again, my learnings from Toothbrushes told me in the question mark, core competence and domain expertise. What did I know about entering Raigad and working with 1 million people in rural Maharashtra and the problems there? And I think the context is you get a few experts and then you apply your entrepreneurial skills. Now, I know I can't run an oil rigging company, and there'll always be some lines in terms of domain expertise. So that was one. And then the second for me was the prospect of looking at one thing that I wanted to create, which would be 10x of my first innings, which was in media and entertainment. And therefore, amongst many sectors that I sort of analyzed, and I narrowed down on education. And the reason for that to me is it's one of the sectors that needs the maximum amount of disruption in a country like India. It's so important, and yet at the same time needs so much of disruption. There is a fair amount of regulation for good reason, and yet how do you actually grow that business in spite of that regulation? And we looked at the K-12 sector, which is the kindergarten to 12th, and we found that it was so heavily regulated that you always needed to have a trust and you need to have a content company, and it didn't make sense. And here we were already committed to a not-for-profit in Swadesh Foundation, and therefore we wanted to get into the education space, and therefore we looked at the higher education space. So I think, if I can sum up my learnings as far as these are concerned, when you're reaching the crossroads, to me, the ability for me to be able to reflect, to look at and focus on what I would want to do versus what I wanted to have to do, and creating impact, have really been the sort of key elements of my second innings, where one has invested and one has started a sports company in a field like kabaddi. Now, to me, that was the closest I could get to my media days. And a lot of people came in and said at that stage, kabaddi, because almost for 7 years, I remember the people who founded the league, which was Anand Mahindra and his brother-in-law, Charu. For 7 years, they were trying to get support for that. And we had a casual dinner conversation, and he says, yeah, well, we've got this sport. My brother-in-law actually wants to start this sport called kabaddi. And I said, wow, that's quite a big idea. He says, really? And I think if you look at that, and over the period of the next 6 months, we got, Star came in as a broadcaster, and that changed the entire thought process. And many other colleagues, 7 other founders bought into that. Fair amount of that because Anand Mahindra called up Uday Kotak, and he called up Kishore Biyani, and he called up business people and said, come on, guys, now we need to start this kabaddi league. But as soon as we kind of gotten there, to me, the element of how to disrupt a sport, and maybe I'll just end with that anecdote, that you see, we've all of us in some form or the other played kabaddi. And all when we reflected, we can never think of that as a sport like cricket or football, because it was always played on the sand and the muddy. In 2 minutes, the players always get filthy and dirty, almost unrecognizable. And it sounded like a very raw sport. So if you take that sport and put it on a mat, you clean up the players and actually take them. And that's what we did to our team captain. We took him to a parlor for 2 days and make the men look hot and sexy. And right now, cricket has 90% male viewership, 10% female viewership. Kabaddi today has 30% female viewership and 70%. And I think you take a sport, we moved it onto the mat, we made it a gladiator sport under the spotlight, and it became a very, very popular sport. And I think part of the fun is, how do you be disruptive on a constant basis? How do you shatter the status quo on an ongoing basis in almost everything that you're doing, whether it's in the social space, in the sports space, in the education space? And I think that's what keeps me going every morning. So again, my apologies for not being there, and thank you very much for allowing me to do this by video conference. Sachin, I hope this was something that you thought what you would like me to share. And now I just be very happy to sort of open this up for an interactive discussion and questions. With only a request that I do have thank you. Only one request is if the questions could be in a mic, and just put the mic close to you, because my ear problem at the moment, I'm a little disoriented because I have an echo, so I just have to hear the question a little sharp. Sorry about that.
The floor open to questions. Yes. You might. Hello, Ronnie. Hi, this is Brian here.
Yeah, I think the mic needs to just be a little louder once. Yeah.
I've never been told to talk louder. I will like louder.
I can't hear yet.
Ronnie, my first question to you is, everything that you've done and through your career has always been ahead of the game.
If you could just, if you can ask the technician there to just put the mic a little louder, please, because on this side, I'm at full volume. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Now can you hear me?
Yes, please, I can. Thank you.
So everything that you've done in your career has always been ahead of the game. So what in today's world they call disruptive. But as you must have faced many times in your life that you've been ahead of the game, and because being ahead of the game, people probably didn't get what you were doing. So how did you tackle that? Because very often when you're ahead of the game, the first mover not necessarily always gets the success.
Yeah.
Because of disruption, the acceptability may not always be there. And I've always, in your career, everything you've done has always been ahead of what anyone else has done.
No, I think that's a very, very good question, and it's been a strong learning for me. So I can give you three quick examples to answer that question very clearly. One, for example, in cable TV. As I mentioned, for a full year, we didn't get a single customer. And there were enough times in there that everyone said, let's call it a day. This is not a business. I already had 20, 30 people in the staff, and it was, let's call it a day at the end of 6 months. There, my conviction was when I started going door to door and meeting customers. I knew there was a need, and I knew there was some sense of a point where, and therefore you needed to stay the course. So my personal conviction on that particular one was, this is a concept that has to arrive. It wasn't a question of pricing at that particular point in time. It was just a question of building credibility. And the more we did that, so actually we created simulated environments. We used to call people down on a Sunday morning in the lobby of the building society and show them Doordarshan and show them this. But it was my personal conviction at that stage that this concept would work. Cut to many years later, we started home shopping in India way before Flipkart, whatever else. And at that stage, we bought time on Doordarshan late evening and started selling and started a home shopping business. And the first 6 months, we actually tasted incredible success. We had multiple products, but one product, which was called the chapati maker or roti maker, became an instant hit. And in about 6 months, we thought, wow, we had hit the jackpot. It was 85% of our revenue. And then one after the other, something went wrong with the overall business. At that particular point in time, that's when one realized, because it's a very small line between being a pioneer and being before your time. And it's very difficult when you're in that business to be able to do that. And I think it took a lot of courage for me at the end of 2 years of the home shopping business to say, this is before its time. Everything that I'm hearing from the customer, my wrong signal for the first 6 months was we tasted so much success with this one product. And I therefore was blinded with the approach that we would do before. And therefore the guts to go back to my two investors and say, this is not a business that's working. I'm sorry you've taken your money. Can I swap you some shares in UTV? But we're getting out of this business and actually calling it a day. And that was the second learning. So I think a concept of being hard enough to know even when to call it a day and exit meaning shut it down, because we were not selling it. We actually shut it down. Now, in retrospect, I can say if we had stuck it out for 10 years, we could have been bigger than Flipkart. But, who cares and who knows? And it's never the case, right? Because hindsight is never relevant and retrospect is not, because you never know what other 10 conditions would have gone your way. So that was my other learning experience, that you got to be hard about that. And maybe the third one I can tell you is when we started our movie business. And for a lot of people think we did very well, but our first 5 movies were an absolute and complete disaster. And my chief financial officer, the board all came to me and said, I know you want to run a B2C company, but you don't know anything about this business. It's so incestuous, let's get out of it. But there again, because of our television background and my ability to say the customer, I do understand, and what is the core. And therefore we said, maybe my business was that I was trying to join them. I was trying to ape at that stage the success of the Yash Johars and the Karans and whatever else. Yash Chopras and the Karan Johars. Whereas actually we needed to be someone different. And then came Rang De Basanti for us. And for a lot of people that said, wow, that's a fluke and that's very lucky. Sure. But at that stage when we greenlit a movie like that, it was partly because we understood our consumer audience so well. Otherwise, it was a recipe set for disaster, because there was no love triangle for a movie that always needed love triangle. You had 6 boys, 30% of the movie was a flashback, and all your heroes die at the end. Complete recipe for saying this movie will never make it. But it was a turning point in many ways in Indian cinema. So I think when you're going for it, it's about conviction, but conviction where you know your consumer very well. And on the other side, when it's not working well, your strength, ability and guts to be able to call it a day and say it's not working out would be my sort of sorry but long answer to your very short question.
No, but that leads me to the next question. Can I ask some more questions, Sachin? I'm here. Okay.
But the good part is you got the mic, so you have the power of the mic. You can just keep asking, right?
Okay, so I'll ask one last one. Okay, the thing is that when you got into this movie industry, and that, like you just mentioned, had a very stereotyped way of working. And what I've seen, what you did with, I didn't know about the first 5 movies, but because everyone remembers success. Nobody remembers failures of other people. So looking back at what you did with Rang De Basanti, and obviously in the first 5 movies, you would have probably tried the same. If you came into an industry completely with a creative mind, a disruptive mind, how were you able to break the mold for the people working for you? Because everything else besides you was also from the industry, I'm sure, whether it's actors, directors, photographers.
So for me, it was very important to find the differentiator. And the differentiator for me, after my first 5 absolute disasters, was what is my strength and what do I bring to the table? And I think what we deciphered was 2 things. One, it was a highly incestuous industry with a lot of talent and a lot of directors that would work together. And therefore, I needed to find a different set of directors and hang my coat with the newer generation of directors who wanted to tell different stories. So my entire strategy was not about front of cast and not the superstars, but actually go and find the best directors and directors that would for the next 10 years build that. And that's how we came up with movies that were very, very different from what we did with Rakesh Om Prakash Mehra to others. So it was a very director-led strategy. And I'm giving that as one incident where you can put that into context with almost any business that you're running. You've got to be able to find your differentiator. And so to me, the differentiator was the ability to hang my coat with directors and strong scripts. And those storylines would then attract that. And that's when we broke the mold, number one. And 2 was the concept, again, of scale. Because when you've got a ratio and you're doing 12 to 15 movies, you'll always have 4 flops. But when you're doing 4 movies, I realize the odds are against you. So where do you get to a critical mass, and how does scale help in some form build a bit of stability to your business was the other 2 learning curves for me. Yeah, just if the mic can be a little louder on my side, if I can just ask whoever's handling the tech part. Thank you. And Sachin, just tell me when the time is up, and you know. Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I can't hear you. I think you've got the mic quite close. We just need the mic a little louder.
You've really touched upon some very relevant points to me personally today, because just as your industry, the jewelry industry also is very incestuous in many ways. So for a first generation entrepreneur who has no godfather, doesn't come from a jewelry based family, you know, and funding is always a problem. What is the single most, and you're a woman. So the very interesting thing about the jewelry industry is you sell to women, but you deal with men. And you are just not a designer, you are a jeweler. I am an alumni of GIA, and it's a challenge because it's completely 2 different sides. What is the single most thing which you would say is important for a first generation woman entrepreneur in this very crazy industry in many ways, but beautiful?
Yeah. Well, there isn't a single word, but if I had to coin it and you had to force me to do that, it would really just be your own confidence. The very fact that you're very clear where you stand and you've got your self-confidence. Nobody's going to be able to rattle that. The second, I would urge you to think about not being so differentiated. I'm not a big fan of this whole differentiator where we need to put women in a cluster and men in a cluster and then keep figuring out there's always, and I think it's worked very seamlessly, and it should work very seamlessly for you. But I think the first and most important part for you is your self-confidence and your conviction. Because at the end of the day, you're not there to prove a point to somebody else. You're doing this to prove a point to yourself and to do it because that's something you want to do. And if you keep that at the back of your mind, almost at every time when you're getting a pushback or you're having a really bad day, which might be 20 out of the 30 days in a month, I'm sure, that's the reservoir that you need to build into. So I think for each one, it's their own. But self-confidence and self-conviction, there is no replacement for that under any circumstances, in your business, in any other business. And just a little bit, I would say don't put yourself in a box and think, oh, but I'm the woman in a man's industry, because the more you think about it, the more it'll affect you.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure, first of all, to hear from you. What I want to know your views on is like how these days, when you talk about entrepreneurs coming in, and how social media and online shopping in India is booming these days. So it's like whenever something like this starts in our country, it's a boom. Like how Flipkart and Myntra and all these online brands started. So they all were just booming. And right now we all can see that where exactly it's going. And then now suddenly social media has become such a huge thing for entrepreneurs. So what is your view on how exactly do we see this in the next coming 10 years or coming years? How exactly is it gonna go in something which helps the entrepreneurs or which helps social media to become bigger, or is it gonna be just a bubble which is gonna burst?
So I'm not sure there's a specific question in your question. So maybe I'll ask you to just sharpen that so that I can answer it in a specific manner. But I'll just give a little bit of answer to what I think it is. See, I think the element of the digital era, the internet and the social media and the medium of communication in many ways has democratized how we communicate. So if you're an entrepreneur, if your question is how do I use the medium, that's quite different. How do you create a business in that medium is a completely different question and a completely different approach. But how do you use that as the best marketing tool? Yes, I find today, in fact, most agencies and advertisers are a little bit of an anachronism and a little bit in the past. It takes them almost 5 years after a new sector comes in for them to understand and appreciate that that's where the younger generations are already moved to. So if your question is, how do I build a business out of that? I would caution you on understand and get an idea validation. Most of us people feel, again, as I said, because it's the front page of the Economic Times and Business Standard and everywhere else where 4 people raised money and at the top of the pyramid, everyone thinks that the next 1,000 will do that. No. What's your core business idea? What's your core differentiator? And most important, the first thing when you want to start a business is idea validation. Because most of us think, I have a great idea. And I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs and they pause after that, thinking, wow, you should now look at me because I have this great idea. I just shared this great idea with you. Don't you think it's a great idea? And I'm saying, yeah, but who cares? Because 40 other people would have thought of this exact same idea somewhere, in some room, somewhere in the world. Now I want to understand what's your business idea on that and what's your action plan. So that's if you want to build a business. And I don't think you should get carried away that some businesses raised a fair amount of money. They still have to prove their business model. Most of these people who've raised and become unicorns still have some ways to prove their business model. I'm not being sarcastic about it, but in a certain ways, I just don't want that to be the role models for a lot of entrepreneurs to follow. Because that's a sense of timing and a lot of things that happened to an organization that took it there. It's very difficult to replicate that. But otherwise, I think what's happening in the social media space today allows entrepreneurs and businesses, including the business and sector of jewelry, to use the digital medium in ways that you can communicate that have hitherto not been known. And it is the job of a CEO, an entrepreneur, and a leader today to understand that. Because if they don't, and if you think just hiring somebody as a digital marketing person is a big mistake, because they'll feel an outsider, you won't be able to guide it, you won't know how to harness it in an organization, and it'll always look like an adjunct. So I'm not sure whether I fully answered your question, but that would be my sort of feedback to you on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, let's give a big round of applause to Mr. Ronnie Screwvala.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks again for having me, and sorry again that I wasn't there in person.
Thank you, Ronnie, for being here.
Thank you. Bye.